Hello, healers. My name is Ben, and this is the Moss Report. I'm here today with my father, author and founder of the Moss Report, Dr. Ralph W. Moss. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning, Ben.
So, lately, you and I have been discussing a number of different subjects related to cancer, and they've been pretty positive. Olive oil, mushrooms, curcumin, and turmeric, these things that we've been able to identify as having both good value, scientifically speaking, and also good to eat and enjoyable. But this topic that we're going to be discussing today is not in that category. This is a topic that is quite literally the biggest concern, the biggest health issue that we have as a civilization, and that is the subject of sugar. This is a really tough topic to discuss, and for a number of reasons, not least of which is that as humans in our society, we've been brought up to equate things that are sweet with reward. The brainwashing that we've undergone has been pervasive in our society right from birth, practically. And so it's a difficult topic to push back on, but it is our obligation to do so, in as much as there is a direct relationship between sugar and cancer, which you're going to tell us about and show us some of the most compelling science in that subject. But before you do that, if you don't mind, I'd like to just speak with our audience directly, something that generally I'm not doing in our podcast. But this topic in particular, I feel compelled to have a more frank and personal discussion and allow those who are listening to hopefully benefit somewhat from my experience. And that is that for most of my life, I haven't really known that I have a metabolism. I didn't really understand it. It was just in the background. You eat and you go about your business, you have energy. And I, for one, never really thought about the process of how or what fuel my body's using for energy. And that has changed. It has changed as a result of three separate occasions where I was trying to intentionally lose weight and my observations around how my body responded to the different diets and approaches that I had to weight loss. Most recently, this came about as the result of two different factors. One was your diagnosis and your battle with prostate cancer, and the other was the regrettable loss of my first cousin, Mark, just a couple of years ago. At a very young age, he was only 57. And he was the closest thing that I had to a brother growing up. And we miss him. And he was a very sweet and lovable person, but he had his own battles with his diet, his weight, and in particular with sugar. So this subject is very personal for me. And what we are trying to do is to be on a campaign of awareness, not just about the things that cause cancer or the things that are good to help fight cancer, but on this front, which is a health concern that's broader than just cancer, in as much as it leads to things like coronary heart disease and, of course, diabetes and obesity and other complications that arise from those conditions. I believe that I'm correct when I say that it is the number one medical concern or the number one source of most medical issues, at least in the United States. So, how do we address this? Well, I can only share what my experience has been, having lost in excess of 50 pounds each of the three times that I've tried to lose weight. And most recently, I'm upwards of 65 pounds lost from just a little bit over a year ago. And primarily, the thing that I did was to eliminate sugar from my diet. And I know that you'll want to clarify what exactly sugar is and what forms it takes, and I'll leave you to do that. But I've eliminated sugars in most of their forms, and I have never felt better. I'm as healthy as I've ever been, and in some ways healthier. And I've discovered that I have this thing called metabolism that for me feels very much like it has two modes. The first mode is when I am eating high carbohydrate, high glycemic, or sugar laden foods. And that mode essentially uses those sugars as fuel for energy. And that's all it does. And my body is very accustomed to doing that. And in fact, I think that's all it ever did for most of my adult life. And what I've discovered is that I have another mode. And it was a bit like a muscle that was very flabby and underused, my metabolic muscle. And that muscle converts more complex molecules into simpler molecules in order to burn them for food, for energy. And in the process, I believe, does a better job at digesting my food and turning it into the other component factors that are inside of food that are healthy. Again, this is not something that I have a meter attached to my arm that shows me these levels, but I know how I feel. I know what my energy levels are. I know what the condition of my health is generally. I feel good, as I said. So it's been a really amazing transformation for me over the last year, losing this weight and turning on my metabolism. I've sometimes used the analogy that burning carbohydrates for fuel is a bit like having some gasoline in a pan and you throw a match on it and it just goes whoosh. And that's the energy. And then when it's burnt, there's no energy. Whereas burning more complex molecules is a little bit like having a wood stove and feeding it wood and it burns. And if you get it cooking just right, you don't even have flame. You've just got nice hot embers that are giving a steady glow for a long period of time. And that energy level feels better in the body.
Yeah.
And if I can make one thing clear to our audience, and I say this with the utmost earnestness and sincerity, and that is to get that metaphor in your head and live it, because there are people out there who are dying because this basic knowledge of what the metabolism is and how it affects and impacts your health is somehow missing from our education. So I'd like to be a teacher. I mean, I have been a teacher in my career, as have you, Dad. And I think in some ways we're trying to still be teachers and teach people a little bit about this aspect of how to achieve health and how to fight against cancer and other health conditions. So with that preamble, and thanks for your patience and for listening, I'll be glad to hear where the science lives as it relates to cancer and sugar from you, and any other thoughts on the subject that you might want to share.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for that. And we were just together at a joyous event about a week ago, or 10 days ago. And your mother remarked on, and other people, your aunt Betty also, about how wonderful you look. And we look at, the people could see the before and after pictures. It's really amazing. You do look better, healthier than I've seen you in a long, long time. So as a parent, of course, it's a joyous occasion. And I totally agree with you. I think there's three major components to this. And again, I can speak from personal experience as well as my 50 years as a science writer. But because I was diagnosed with diabetes about 9 years ago now. Um, so I'm very aware of this issue on a personal level, but also from a science writer point of view. I think sugar is a big part of it, the most important part. But the three things that I have found control blood sugar and have brought me from being in a state of extremely high blood sugar. My blood sugar was 372 when I was first diagnosed. Normal would be you'd want to have under 100. Between 100 and 126 is considered pre-diabetes, which isn't a disease. It's a high risk factor for getting diabetes, or allowing your body to have diabetes. Um, and then under a fasting blood glucose of under 100 is considered normal, between 70 and 100. I was 372, and my A1C was also very high. And now my A1C is in the pre-diabetes range. I'm in remission of diabetes, um, and my fasting sugars are usually under 126. So I've been pretty successful. In fact, one doctor said, "You cured yourself of diabetes." I said, "I didn't cure myself exactly, because I could bring it on in a day or two if I wanted to." It's
Hmm.
just that was so. What is it? It's mostly about the food, but there's two other factors: exercise, which is to say your activity level, how many steps you get in per day, or how much you run, or aerobic exercise, uh, or stress exercise. All of those things are very important. At my age, and just because I'm not a very athletic person, but I do try to get in as many steps per day as reasonable to do, which would be aiming for that 10,000 mark, or walk in the woods for between a half an hour and an hour per day, which also relates to the third thing. The third thing is the stress level in your body, and you're not always aware of this, but it's kind of a barometer. The blood sugar is kind of a barometer of stress in complicated ways. But these three things are kind of going on simultaneously. What you eat, when you eat, another big factor we could talk about, the exercise or activity level, and the stress level. And that's, in my experience, as well as in what I've read, I mean, that's what determines how your body is going to feed that flame, as you put it correctly. So that's important. If those things get out of whack, you start to develop insulin insensitivity, meaning that sugar doesn't just get into your cells; it needs an usher to get into the cells, and that usher is the hormone insulin that's normally produced by the pancreas gland. So if the muscles um, become insensitive and the tissues become insensitive to insulin, the insulin's knocking on the door, but your body is not, the cells are not answering to that knock, to the call. Then you have insulin insensitivity, meaning the insulin is there and the sugar is there, and you're not burning the sugar in the way that you are supposed to, not to the degree that you are. That's why your blood sugar goes up. For the people with type 2 diabetes, which is in some ways the opposite of type 1 diabetes, they have enough insulin. In fact, they have too much insulin in their blood. But the insulin is fine. The insulin it wants to usher the sugar into the cell, but the cell's not opening up to receive the insulin.
Hmm.
And the other name for that, there's other names, but the other name for that is metabolic syndrome. So when you have metabolic syndrome, I mean, diabetes, almost type 2 diabetes, that's all I'm talking about in this video. Type 2 diabetes is rarely comes alone as a medical condition, despite what doctors specialists may think, it almost always is accompanied by other conditions. And the other conditions of the metabolic syndrome relate to the heart, cardiovascular, propensity to cardiovascular disease, and um, and and other causes of disease, including a propensity towards cancer and obesity being the physical, the outward manifestation of the metabolic syndrome. I knew Robert Atkins, the inventor of the Atkins diet. I knew him very well. And he coined the word diabesity. So what did he mean? He wanted to emphasize to the public that diabetes and obesity were the same disease. Not just that they were often found together, but that actually in the Western world in particular, um, when you see obesity, you're seeing the main manifestation of metabolic syndrome. And when you have diabetes, in the Western world at least, it's almost always associated with overweight or obesity. So a syndrome is a group of seemingly different diseases that come together at the same time. And high blood pressure is another condition caused by or associated with this metabolic syndrome. So what percentage of people in the United States or in Europe actually have this condition? It's about half. Half the population in the United States, by government statistics, um, has abnormal blood sugar levels, high blood sugar levels, mostly. So, meaning that that would include prediabetes, which is between 100 and 126 milligrams per deciliter. Other countries have different ways of measuring that, but I'll give the American standard because that's what I'm most familiar with. And then over 126, you're in the realm of diabetes. If you have a blood sugar test 2 days in a row that's over 126 or over, that's diagnostic for diabetes. And adding up those numbers, and the government has broken this down to the 10th of a percentage point and tests this every couple of years, it has varied between 48 and 50% of the adult population in the United States has diabetes or prediabetes, which is to say, that's the minimum that has metabolic syndrome. But you're not counting in that all the people in their 20s and 30s and 40s who are already showing signs of the syndrome. That's to say, overweight or their blood pressure is too high. The dam is leaking, but the dam hasn't broken yet. See, when the dam breaks, then the numbers go sky high because you don't have any way now to prevent that sugar from building up in your blood. And that has direct consequences and indirect consequences. But underlying it all is this condition, this metabolic syndrome. And we see this all over the world, that this diet, this industrialized diet, has spread. It doesn't seem to have any end to the degree to which it is replacing and has replaced traditional diets, which are much healthier in general.
Yeah.
And a lot has been, written about this, but everywhere in the world, cancer rates are going up as people adopt that, lifestyle that originated in the West, but is spread all over the globe. So the science of sugar and cancer really goes back 100 years, almost exactly 100 years. And the great German scientist and Nobel Prize winner Otto Warburg published a paper around 1923 on the relationship between sugar and cancer. And it relates to how tumors are supplied with oxygen and glucose in the body. And he says the tumor cells obtain the energy required for their existence in two ways: by respiration and by fermentation. Now, the normal way of generating energy for cells is respiration. That's to say, they burn organic materials, and the end result of that is carbon dioxide and water. But in fermentation, they directly split the sugar molecule, glucose, to lactic acid. All tumors so far tested behave fundamentally alike. So the key here is the fermentation of tumors, meaning fermentation meaning that they take the glucose and they produce lactic acid. This is still true. This was a correct observation, one of the most important findings ever made in the field of cancer. And it's the basis for the PET scan and the PET CT scan when they use a sugar-like molecule called FDG, inject that into the patient, and then they scan for the radioactive component of that FDG molecule, and that tells them where the cancer is. So cancer is more or less, even in conventional medicine, is more or less defined as tissue that has a greatly increased uptake of sugar. And the amount could be, 15 or 16 times as much.
So Otto Warburg, you said, was awarded the Nobel Prize for this work or for this type of work?
This type of work. This was a big part of, but he made many more discoveries and was considered the greatest biochemist of the 20th century.
What a hero.
Yes, he was a complex character, to put it
Okay.
mildly. I never met him. He died before I became involved in the field, but I knew two people who knew him well, and he was a piece of work, but he made fantastic discoveries. He was a fantastic scientist. So what Warburg found was that unlike most normal tissue, cancer cells ferment to get a lot of their energy, and meaning ferment just like yogurt or some other biological food that we might eat, sauerkraut and different foods that are fermented, beer. Uh, the cancer cell directly can turn sugar, meaning glucose, into um, byproducts like lactic acid, which is what makes the area around the cancer highly acidic. So this has been confirmed. It's confirmed every day 1,000 times because the very common scanning technique for cancer called the PET scan, also known as the PET CT scan, that's looking for the increased uptake of sugar by different tissues. And if a tissue unexpectedly shows a great deal of uptake of or consumption of sugar, that's a very strong suspicion that that tissue is cancer.
But this is a diagnostic tool that's actively in use by oncologists to determine if something is a cancer when they do a scan. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's used as one of the tools, and oftentimes it's paired with the CT scan because the PET scan produces kind of a fuzzy image. It tells you there's cancer there, but it doesn't give you an exact description or a visualization of the tumor. But
Okay,
the
so I'm sorry,
CT
but
does.
I'm getting a little upset about this because, on the one hand, you're telling me that doctors and oncologists are already utilizing a tool that detects cancer based on this factor, the way that the tissue is taking up and utilizing glucose as a fuel. But these very same doctors don't tell their patients, like, maybe you shouldn't be consuming as much glucose. They don't
Quite,
have that
quite the
conversation.
opposite. They don't put two and two together.
I don't understand that.
I don't
And it's
understand it
upsetting
either.
because obviously there's a connection.
It's a very, very intimate connection, as you can see. And this is not refuted work. This work it was at one time thought to be erroneous, but it's come roaring back because obviously, if the PET scan works, then there is increased glucose being taken up by the tissue. And Warburg was right about that by cancer tissue. I have seen situations, Ben, where the same doctor ordered the PET scan in the morning and in the afternoon delivered a lecture to the patient saying it doesn't matter what you eat. You can eat anything you want. In our own life, somebody we know who's dealing with cancer was basically told, eat whatever you want. And when somebody asked about taking like vegetable juices, the oncologist said, well, drink whatever you want, which led to a joking discussion of whiskey and bourbon and things like that. So it's sometimes dealt with in a supercilious manner.
I can't even comment on that.
Yeah. So this is the foundation, this paper, the foundation of the understanding of the metabolism of cancer, not just of sugar, but the whole question of the metabolism. In other words, science has known for 100 years that the manner by which cancerous cells derive their energy is fundamentally different than the manner that normal cells derive their energy. We've known this for 100 years, but it's not acted on. And it's been the biggest struggle, one of the biggest struggles within oncology has been to get this, recognized, get this fact recognized and see what the implications of this are. But from a layperson's point of view, it seems pretty obvious that if sugar drives the ferocious growth of cancer cells, you wouldn't really want to throw gasoline on the fire, as you put it. You wouldn't want to throw fuel on the fire by having a high intake of sugar, because sugar is what the cancer is waiting and hoping for. Now, that's just common sense.
It astounds me how, after human beings have been living on this planet for how long, that we still don't understand nutrition and how to eat and the metabolism. And this type of thing should be required reading from kindergarten on. I mean, it just should be a part of our education. It wasn't that long ago. In fact, it was in my lifetime that things such as cigarette smoking or cigarettes were allowed to be advertised in front of children. In fact, directly marketed to children here in this country. I recall there was the cartoon, The Flintstones. And the Flintstones at one time, I think, was sponsored by a cigarette company. And in the breaks in between, as a commercial, they would have the Flintstones walking around, both of them smoking cigarettes to
And what about
children.
all the ads that went on for decades of doctors smoking and endorsing cigarette?
The way I see television advertising around these products that contain sugar, as though they have no consequence whatsoever, it reminds me very much of the Flintstones walking around smoking cigarettes. Let's say 20 years from now, we're going to be looking back on all of these ads for all of these sweet, sugary things, I hope, and scratching our heads the same way we look back on those Flintstones smoking cigarette commercials. We need to have that same type of awareness around the science that relates to health with sugar, as we do now have front and center the science that is pointing to the relationship between tobacco use and health.
I agree. This is a paper from China, from Xi'an, called Hyperglycemia, a neglected factor during cancer progression. And they make some very interesting points here, which is that there is a higher cancer incidence in people with type 2 diabetes excess glucose supplies for the sugar to the glucose-hungry cells. The effect of hyperglycemia on cancer progression in cancer patients with abnormal blood glucose should not be neglected, although it is almost always neglected. And hyperglycemia or high blood sugar may contribute to a more malignant type of cancer and lead to drug resistance. Therefore, controlling hyperglycemia or high blood sugar may have important therapeutic implications for cancer patients. This is a review article, meaning they're reviewing the entire topic, which is very helpful because they go through, studies that might be hard to find otherwise. And they show that diabetes, which is the most extreme form of hyperglycemia, plays a crucial role in the development of liver, pancreatic, colorectal, breast, endometrial, and bladder cancers. And especially the strongest association is with liver and pancreatic cancer. But they talk about a 41% increase in cancer mortality, cancer death rate, related to endometrial, breast, and colorectal cancer in patients with pre-existing diabetes compared to those with normal blood glucose levels. A 41% increase in the death rate. And these are scientific facts. These are not just my opinions. These are scientific facts. And look, when you have the majority of people in the population are at increased risk of diabetes, you can see the connection. Or if you're not blind, you can see the connection. And then I want to point out a couple of other papers that I think people should be aware of. So for a long time, there was a neglect of the topic of Warburg's research. And in fact, it went completely out of favor. Out of favor so much that when I first came into the field as a science writer almost 50 years ago, there were 0 new articles published on the Warburg effect, which is what the overconsumption of sugar by cancer cells is called. So I looked in PubMed, the big database of journal articles, and throughout the 1970s and 1980s, it had gone, the mentions of Warburg and mentions of this effect have gone down literally to 0 in some years. And it was basically considered a dead duck, just an outdated theory. And the sugar consumption, there was no barriers put up intellectually to the consumption of sugar. One of the people who has done the most to revive this theory is Thomas Seyfried, who is a professor of biology at Boston College. And I actually visited him there at his lab. And he has a big, thriving lab. I think he has like 20 associates in that laboratory, including graduate students and so forth. And he's a great person, I think, a great scientist and just a great all-around person. And he has written a book called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And this was a scientific article based upon that book. And here's what he says. He says that essentially all the hallmarks of cancer, including the Warburg effect, can be linked to impaired function of the mitochondria, which are the energy-generating centers within the cell. A view of cancer as primarily a metabolic disease will impact approaches to cancer management and prevention. So what does he mean by emphasizing that cancer is a metabolic disease? Well, the overwhelming belief among oncologists and many other scientists is that cancer is a genetic disease. But the cancer may not be originating in the nucleus of the cell, in other words, in the genes. The cancer may be originating in another part of the cell, which is the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the energy portion, the energy generating portion of the cell. And there's good arguments to be made for this, and people who are interested will give the link to this article and they can read it for themselves. But there has been a transition because of his work and the work of some other great scientists. There's been a transition towards this view, a recognition. And I want to show, for instance, this is another article, came out about the same time as Seyfried's book and article, and I want to point out to the viewers who the authors of this are. Understanding the Warburg effect, the metabolic requirements of cell proliferation. So the authors are Van den Heijden, who's at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, one of the top cancer centers in the country, in the United States. The second author, Lewis Cantley, was at Harvard Medical School. And the third author, Craig Thompson, is listed in 2009, listed as his affiliation being the Abramson Cancer Center at the University of Pennsylvania. But then quickly, soon after this, became the president of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and just retired last year. So for more than 10 years, he was the head of Memorial Sloan Kettering. And here's what they wrote. In contrast to normal cells, which rely on the mitochondria to generate energy needed for driving the cells, most cancer cells instead rely on what's called aerobic glycolysis, which is also called the Warburg effect, meaning that they can produce energy directly from glucose, even in the presence of oxygen. That's the definition of the Warburg effect. So this is an inefficient way to generate energy, but the advantage is that it's adapted to facilitate the uptake and incorporation of nutrients. In other words, that the cancer cell can feed itself by switching to, at least partially, this process of fermentation in order to get all the energy that it needs, because it needs a lot more energy than the normal cells do. And Craig Thompson has done as much as anyone, maybe as much as Tom Seyfried, to get across the point of view of the importance of the Warburg effect. So how did this play out in terms of the sort of the politics of cancer? I want to show the last paper that I want to share with you, which is Hallmarks of Cancer, the Next Generation. This may be the most cited, possibly the most impactful paper ever written on the topic of cancer, at least in the last couple of decades. It is the most downloaded article from the journal Cell ever, the precursor to this, and this one, which was the update of it, and so they point out that in addition to the 6 main characteristics of cancer that they had identified in their earlier paper, that progress has added 2 emerging hallmarks to this list: the reprogramming of energy metabolism and the evading of immune destruction, which we've talked about elsewhere. But the most important one from our point of view is that they added to the key hallmarks of cancer the change in the use of glucose by cancer cells, which they call reprogramming of energy metabolism.
That's the
So
Warburg effect.
that's the Warburg effect. It was added in 2011 by Hanahan and Weinberg to their classic paper. In early cultures, pre-industrial societies, cancer was very rare. They didn't have as good diagnostic techniques as we do, but about 1/3 of cancers will eventually come to the surface of the body. You don't have to be a genius to see a breast tumor if it's not being treated. The Romans and the Greeks knew breast cancer, as many other cancers. They knew them very well. They just were rare diseases. In all of antiquity, I think there was only one book ever written, one manuscript book ever written on cancer. That was Galen's book on tumors. And we have hospital records from the 19th century because I think this cancer epidemic really started around the time sugar became widely available, but mid 19th century. And cancer was extremely rare, like in Paris um, in the mid 19th century, extremely rare. It was there. It always has been around. Even the dinosaurs, there is some indication some of them had tumors, but it was a rare disease, and not for lack of looking. And the strongest example, I think, was among the Inuit. There were many medical missionaries who went to the northern part of the globe and ministered to the native population, and they didn't see any cancer until the early 1930s, and that was in Inuit people who had adopted canned foods as a main source of the diet. Today, they have the same, if not higher, rates of cancer than the U.S. mainland population. But, but, but there were many good observers, including the president of University of California at Berkeley, who went there and couldn't find any cancer. Albert Schweitzer, who won the Nobel Prize and was a medical doctor, medical missionary in Africa, said that when he came to Africa, there was no cancer in the native population.
None.
None. And there's also evidence that among the other, I don't want to use the term native because it has a pejorative sound to it, but the people living in their traditional lifestyles, cancer is very rare. It does exist. It existed in ancient Egypt, but only, as far as we know, only among the upper classes who had access to sweets, honey, and other, sweet plants. So I'm not saying that everything is due to sugar. That would be an exaggeration, but it certainly plays its part. And about 50% of the foods in the supermarket have added sugar. And some of them, of course, are much worse culprits than others. So how do you shop? You generally shop on the periphery of the supermarket, meaning you go from the produce aisle down to the dairy case, down to the meat case and the yogurts and so forth. So, and the frozen vegetables and so forth. So that would be the main areas that you would find the foods that are safe to eat from a glycemic or a metabolic point of view. So I think you have to shop intelligently. If you want to be really healthy, then that's what you have to do. Look to the diet, eliminate the refined carbohydrates, refined grains, and primarily grains, potatoes, underground vegetables in general, especially French fries and things like that, um, and anything with sugar in it, except minuscule amounts of sugar, and um, and then also look to your exercise level. Increase your exercise or get up to the level that's recommended, at least a half hour a day of good outdoor activity or gym activity, and then try to reduce your stress with yoga or other means. If you do those things, you'll probably be able to pull yourself back from the brink. The effect of sugar, we don't have to argue, because you'll get an argument, oh, well, sugar is not a carcinogen. It won't directly grow the cancer. Well, that remains to be seen. What is not debatable is that obesity and overweight contribute to the risk of cancer. Endometrial cancer, 3 times the rate in women who are overweight or obese than people who have normal weight. So if you're struggling with your weight, that's a pretty strong indication that you've already have metabolic syndrome and you need to adopt a relatively low carb diet. If you've got type 2 diabetes, my experience and that of thousands of other people is that a very low carb diet will bring you back into the normal range or just into the pre-diabetes range. And I've kept this going for 9 years without taking medication. So I can speak with great authority on this. I didn't invent this diet. Robert Atkins talked about this. I have a book from the year 1903 called it's called Diet for Diabetes or something like that, but it's an old English book in which it's exactly the same diet that I eat. That's also called Dr. Bernstein's diabetes solution. You go very low carb. You use almond flour instead of grain flour. You use almond milk, things like that. So there are ways, and they're not terribly difficult, to pull yourself back from the brink. If you don't, you're running the risk of becoming a statistic, and you don't want to do that. Before I got diabetes, there were many red flags that I ignored. My A1C was going up, my fasting blood glucose was going up. It should have set off alarm bells. And unfortunately, despite all that I've read and know about, these issues, when it came to myself, I let it slide. I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to change my diet. I loved my pastas and my other, comfort foods and so forth. When the dam breaks and you suddenly wind up with a sugar 372, as I did, and they're putting you on insulin, and prescribing metformin and telling you that you're inevitably going to be on insulin every day, which is what I was told, then you hopefully you're going to take it seriously. But by then, you've broken the mechanism somehow. It's hard to
Except you're
get
told
back.
you can eat whatever you want as long as you take enough insulin.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll cover it with, you eat what you want, we'll cover it with the insulin. Like there's no consequences to taking insulin and no cost to taking insulin. So I would just say to people, get your blood tested every year by your doctor, the CBC and the metabolic panel. Get your blood tested. Learn a little bit about how to read those blood tests, especially look at your glucose number. Make sure you're fasting when you have the blood taken, because that's the only way to get a good baseline number. And if it's in the high 90s or over 100, take that seriously. Act on that now, because it'll be a lot easier to act on that when it's in the early stages, like everything else, than if you wait for it to, as I did, to really get out of hand.
And I personally have done this a number of times. I'm working with a naturopath, but it all started with you actually recommending that I get this blood panel done. And
Yeah,
in fact, I went to the Life Extension website as you suggested at that time, a year and a half ago or so,
yeah,
and ordered up the complete blood panel, which then they sent down from Life Extension to LabCorp, and we got the blood draw. And that's what I walked into the naturopath's office with, the results of that test. And I said,
right.
I'm looking to do good things for my body. I was dealing with a number of health concerns that related to this metabolic disorder that you're talking about,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
metabolic syndrome. I guess I was also pre-diabetic. I was having some symptoms relating to what the naturopath thought might be fatty liver. I had sleep apnea. I had
yeah,
other situations that I was dealing with in my health. It was deteriorating.
yeah,
And I took that dramatic step to change my diet. And in the past year and a couple of months, as I said, I've lost a lot of weight and I just feel great. And I just want that for everybody. I want them all
amen.
to experience this the same way that I have. A healthy, low glycemic diet, from our perspective at the Moss Report, is the key factor in a healthy, cancer free, hopefully, and metabolic disorder free life. So, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
No, I think you've said it all.
Well, thank you for that education. As always, we appreciate it so much. But for now, for the Moss Report, I'm Ben Moss. How are you healing today? Thank you for watching. We really appreciate all of the support. Please leave a like, a comment, subscribe to the channel, and visit themossreport.com. We wish you all the best for health and healing.